Hi, welcome to yet another fun and interesting screencast. This one is going to cover both blood vessels and the lymphatic system. Hopefully, it won't be too long. Look at the overall time. If the thing is more than 25 minutes or so long, feel free to pause it in the middle, go away, do something else. I think you can't really watch screencasts for too long. But I just want to get it over with all in one shot because technically it's a lot easier to do one screencast than two. But remember, give yourself a break. Most people can't concentrate that long. So we're talking about blood vessels. On this slide, the important things to know are things that we kind of already know. One is the arteries are defined as blood vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart, right? Usually oxygenated, except for the case of your pulmonary and fetal circulation. Right? Pulmonary arteries, deoxygenated blood going away from the heart. Umbilical arteries, deoxygenated or partially deoxygenated blood going away from the heart to the placenta. Veins carry blood to the heart, generally deoxygenated blood, with the exception of your umbilical veins and your pulmonary veins, because they're both coming from oxygen sources going to the heart. In between the two is your capillaries, which we are not going to talk too much about. But what you want to envision is that you have large arteries that branch into smaller and smaller arteries and then into what are called arterioles. And then you have the capillaries, where the blood flows a little slower and these vessels are a little leaky, so some fluid can leak out. You can get gas exchange and nutrient and waste exchange between the fluid that's in the blood vessels and the interstitial or extracellular fluid that's percolating throughout all of your tissues in between all of your cells. We're not going to talk too much about flow, other than it's important. You want to make sure that blood is flowing to all of your organs, and you want to make sure that your pressure is high enough to ensure that blood is flowing to all of your organs. All of this we've talked about in lab. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Resistance is important to us because resistance, as it says here, opposes flow. And we want to keep flow constant without increasing pressure too much. So the more resistance you have, the more pressure you have to put behind the blood to get it to flow through. So we want maximum flow with the least amount of pressure, which means we want to reduce resistance as much as we can if we're talking about keeping blood pressure within healthy limits. There are, as it shows down here, 3 different sources of resistance: viscosity, total blood vessel length, and blood vessel diameter. Viscosity we don't really care about too much. By the time your blood is dehydrated enough to become viscous enough to significantly increase resistance, you've got bigger problems than just your blood pressure. You're like severely dehydrated and probably going to die. So for the most part, we don't worry about viscosity. When we're talking about blood vessel length, where that comes into play is sort of bigger people versus smaller people. If you're taller, you have more blood vessels. This is a little bit harder on the heart. And then the other place where this comes in is that if you put on a lot more muscle or a lot more fat, that is new tissue that needs to have blood supply. So you will grow new arteries if you significantly increase the size of your body. And that can lead to overall increases in blood vessel length and peripheral resistance, and can put extra strain on your heart because your blood pressure is going up due to the resistance. The major way that your body controls flow is through blood vessel radius. And we don't talk about this very much, but because radius increases resistance and resistance decreases flow, your autonomic nervous system can cause vasodilation or vasoconstriction in different tissues at different times so that blood is flowing where you want it to. So you dilate the blood vessels in the tissues that you want the blood to go to. You constrict the blood vessels in the tissues that you don't want the blood to go through. The important thing to take away from this slide as you're looking at it is this big drop in pressure that takes place as blood flows from arteries through the capillaries into the veins. And this is one of the reasons why I say that arterial pressure is not necessarily connected to venous pressure. So you can have high blood pressure in your arteries stressing your heart. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have more pressure in your veins, which would increase venous return and help your heart out. There's a big disconnect between them because the blood slows down so much as it flows through the capillaries. The other important result of, or I should say consequence, I guess, of this big drop in blood pressure is that your body has to have mechanisms in place to help venous blood get back to the heart, because the pressure is so low in these veins that it doesn't get back to the heart very easily. This we talked about, so we're going to skip right over that and talk about these two major factors that aid in venous return. There's this third one here, but as far as I know, it's not as important as these other two. So you have the respiratory pump and the muscular pump, both of which are possible open-ended essay questions. And I think what we should do is look at some pictures while I talk about the text that's on there, and don't worry about the text so much. So I inserted this picture, you don't have it in your PowerPoints, I'm sorry, so that we can talk about the respiratory pump. So you've got your diaphragm here, and then what you want to remember is that your inferior vena cava runs through your abdominal cavity, actually through a hole in your diaphragm, and then up into your thoracic cavity where your heart is. Every time you inhale, your diaphragm pushes down or gets pulled down when the muscle fibers shorten. What this does is put pressure on your abdominal contents, so creating a high pressure zone in your abdomen. That puts pressure on your inferior vena cava. At the same time, you're increasing the volume in your thoracic cavity, so the pressure is decreasing in your thoracic cavity, and the blood in your inferior vena cava essentially gets squished by the pressure in your abdomen up into your thorax and then back to your heart. So the more you breathe, say like when you're exercising, this increases venous return to the heart. And if you remember, if you increase venous return, that increases preload and cardiac output goes up. So just the mechanics of your body are great. The way your body works mechanically makes it easier for your heart to increase cardiac output at the times when you need it. The muscular pump does the same thing. And the important parts of the muscular pump to remember is the pressure being generated by skeletal muscle and the fact that there are valves in your veins. So you've got veins sort of within muscles or even on top of muscles, but contained within a relatively small compartment of the body with connective tissue surrounding both the vein and the muscle, so that when the muscle contracts and swells to fill that compartment, it puts pressure on the vein. This increases your blood pressure, and because the valves only allow blood to move in the direction going closer to the heart, whenever you contract a muscle, it milks the blood through your veins closer to your heart. So both of these, your respiratory pump and your muscular pump, are going to be more active when you're exercising, and those are the times when you need increased blood flow to your muscles. So your body mechanically increases its own cardiac output when it needs it, which I think is just pretty cool. So that's blood vessels. We did that in 9 minutes. We will try and rocket through the lymphatic system without being nonsensical. So what your lymph does is two important things. One, it returns blood that has leaked out of your capillaries, or fluid that is leaked out of your capillaries gets returned to your circulatory system or back to your blood vessels. So your capillaries have relatively high pressure because they're being fed by arteries, and they're very permeable. There are small holes and gaps in the epithelial wall that allow fluid to actually leak out of your blood vessels. This fluid is called interstitial fluid. When that interstitial fluid gets taken up by your lymphatic system, it is called lymph. And this lymph flows through a series of vessels that we won't cover too much, and then gets dumped back into your bloodstream where your two subclavian veins meet. Along the way, because this fluid is derived from the blood and has sort of percolated through your tissues, your immune system monitors it to look for signs of infection or clean up infections that are either in the bloodstream or in the tissues and getting sucked up with the lymph or the interstitial fluid. So you've got those two things going on here. This slide we don't care about at all, so we're going to skip right over it. And then don't spend any time looking at that. We're going to skip right ahead to here, and I'll talk about what was on that last slide. So what that slide says is that the lymph is delivered into one of two large ducts. You have the right lymphatic duct, which gets all of the lymph that comes from the right side of your head and the upper right quadrant of your torso. So right side of your thorax and your right arm all gets dumped into the right lymphatic duct. The lymph from the rest of your body gets dumped into what's called the thoracic duct. The reason why it's called the thoracic duct is because it's connected to this duct that runs through your thorax. So top right quadrant of your body, right lymphatic duct, everything else thoracic duct. It's confusing, but that's A and P, which unfortunately is just confusing. This is just a close-up of those two ducts going in, and we don't really need to talk about it. You can look at it if you want to know where they go in. So what we're going to talk about very briefly is lymphatic capillaries. We're not going to cover sort of all of the other lymphatic vessels, but just the capillaries and one specific type of capillary. What you want to know about the lymphatic capillaries is that because of their structure, they are much more permeable than a blood capillary. So if you look, let's say right here, this end of this cell right here is anchored to the tissue around it. So this little piece of cell here isn't going anywhere. This end of this cell here is free. And it can flop open this way, kind of like one of those carabiner or clips that people use to clip their keys onto their backpack, or maybe your water bottle. So it clips open and then flaps shut, which means that it's really easy for fluid to get into your lymphatic system, which is important because the fluid's not really under any pressure. So the upside of being very permeable is that it helps clear the lymph from your tissues. The downside is that cancer cells and pathogens can get in there real easy. It's not so much a problem if your pathogens get in there because your lymph flows through tissues that contain most of your immune system. So that part's actually a good thing. But unfortunately, cancer can hitch a ride throughout the body rather easily by getting into your lymphatic system, and that's kind of the downside of it. I will not talk too much about lacteals other than to tell you that they are specialized lymphatic capillaries that you find in your intestines. The mucosal membrane lining of your intestines has lacteals, and they are there to absorb the fat that is in your diet, right? Because oil and water don't mix, so a lot of your fat doesn't end up in your bloodstream, which is mostly watery. It ends up in the lymph. And then gets processed into something that's not quite so lipid-like or hydrophobic, and ultimately ends up in your bloodstream, but it gets absorbed by your lymphatic tissues, or your lymphatic capillaries, called lacteals. So before we talk about specific lymphoid organs, which we're going to talk about, we have to talk about lymphoid tissue, which is the structure that all of your lymphoid organs have in common. This is a lymph node over here. It is very much indicative of what any lymphoid organ would look like. Um, these little white circular structures here are called follicles. And once you develop an eye for spotting them, you can spot lymphoid organs when you see one on a microscope, or even lymphoid tissues if you're looking at another organ that might have a little bit of lymphoid tissue in it to house your immune system cells. So the follicles, as it says right there, are indicative of lymphoid tissue. What you find in these follicles are your T cells and your B cells, or your lymphocytes. We will talk more about them when we do the blood, so don't worry about remembering what T cells do versus what B cells do. Just know that they are lymphocytes, which you find in lymphatic tissue. You are also going to find macrophages, which is a specific type of phagocyte that is derived from one of your blood cells. We will talk about that in more detail when we do the blood. But the macrophages are there to gobble up anything that's not supposed to be in the lymph. It might be a virus or a bacteria. It might just be a dead cell or some debris, protein, junk that ended up in the lymph. Don't worry about dendritic cells. That's way too specific for us. And then the reticular cells are there to produce the reticular fibers from which this particular type of tissue gets its name. I forgot to mention it, I think, but the particular type of connective tissue that you find in lymph nodes is called reticular tissue, or that you find in any lymphatic tissue. So if you remember, you might remember this picture here from Anatomy and Physiology 1. When I teach reticular tissue, I say that it looks like a bunch of grapes. And here you have your vine, and then these purple things are all of the grapes hanging off of it. So you have just enough of these black reticular fibers to hold all of these purple cells together, and then fluid, be it lymph or whatever else, trickles through all of these cells, kind of the way water trickles through the charcoal on your Brita filter. And then it gets filtered by the macrophages, physically filtered, and then it gets scanned by your immune cells or your lymphocytes, and they look for signs of infection. So now we're going to go through some of these specific lymphatic tissues, and we're going to go through them really quick. Again, the lymphatic system we don't cover very deeply, and I don't want to take too long for this. So the lymph nodes you can find throughout your body. And what we saw up here, whoops, I went back too far. This is what a lymph node looks under the microscope. And this is where you find them all over your body. There are 4 major accumulations of lymph nodes. You have your inguinal nodes, your axillary nodes, your cervical nodes, and then you have a lot of them in your abdominal region. But actually it's 3, I miscounted talking so quick. The 3 major superficial accumulations of lymph nodes is inguinal, axillary, and cervical. But you do have quite a few in your abdominal region. They're just not close to the surface. So one of the things the doctor is checking for you when he says he's checking for swollen glands is the lymph nodes in your cervical region to see if you're fighting a cold and lots of virus or bacteria is getting into the bloodstream there. Then those lymph nodes are going to swell up, because that's what happens when your immune system kicks in. I don't know if we've talked about it before, but if you do actually have an infection, inflammation is a good thing. We don't like the pain that comes with it, so we tend to think of inflammation as a bad thing, and we want to get rid of it as soon as possible following an injury. But when you have an infection, you want inflammation. We'll talk about that more when we do the immune system. Lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes, as it says here, do 2 important things. Filtering is the physical process of just removing the stuff that's not supposed to be there. And then the cells that are doing the filtering are part of your immune system. So your lymph nodes are actively filtering and fighting any possible infectious agents. We are going to skip over this slide. This is technically some anatomy that you're supposed to know in lecture, but I never put a picture on the lymph node on the exam, so we'll skip right over it. Which also means we can skip over this. It's just a very nice picture of a lymph node with all of the follicles and the connective tissue capsule around the outside of it. I think we can skip this as well. I don't usually ask about this stuff. The important thing, actually, I take it back, moving too quickly. This last line here that is underlined is important. I don't always ask about it, but it's an important concept to get down. So you have lymphocytes and other cells that are housed within your lymphatic system, but they don't always necessarily stay put. So one particular T cell might spend, I don't know, a day or two in one of your lymph nodes and then let go, float through the lymph into the bloodstream, circulate around, and show up in another lymph node somewhere else. This becomes important when we think about the fact that our immune system is just that. It is systemic. So that when you learn how to fight an infection, a virus or a bacteria, you can fight that infection wherever it shows up, because the cells of your immune system that have been educated against that specific virus or that specific bacteria don't just hang out in the lymph node where they first encountered it. They circulate. So your immunity circulates as well. The spleen, I forgot to put in the link to the What Does the Spleen Do video. I'll show you guys that later in class if you haven't seen it already. We talked about it when we did blood in one of the sections. At any rate, what's underlined here is the important part of what the spleen does. It removes dead red blood cells from the circulation. I will say no more about that. The spleen filters dead red blood cells from your circulation. This is what it looks like. You'll never see a slide of it either on the practical or in lecture. The thymus is interesting. It would be nice if we had more time to talk about it. It is where your T cells mature. So as you grow and your T cells are generated in your bone marrow and your immune system develops, they get tested in your thymus and then they get released into the wider circulation. And as the amount of T cells that you have increases, your thymus gets smaller because your body is producing fewer of them. So by the time you are a fully grown adult, you're done producing T cells and your thymus starts to atrophy. This is why the thymus isn't on the models in the lab, because the models are adults and the thymus just doesn't show up in adults. Tonsils. The tonsils are little lymphatic organs or patches of lymphatic tissue that you find around your pharynx, which is the back of your throat. Wherever you have a common passageway for both food and air, it's referred to as pharynx. And then when that splits, you get your trachea and your esophagus. So what this essentially does, or one of the things it does, is sample environmental pathogens that are passing through you. So if you, let's say, eat a well-cooked hamburger, any bacteria that might have been in that hamburger are dead and not a threat to you, but some of that might make it into the tonsil, and your immune system can still take that bacteria apart and study it. And even if some of the bacteria in your food are still alive, they're going to end up dead once they make it to your stomach. So most of the time the bacteria that you eat or the viruses that you eat don't kill you because they end up in a pit of acid, which is your stomach. But your tonsils, this lymphatic tissue, can get exposed to these bacteria and these viruses, and it's a way for your immune system to get a sneak peek at what's in the environment before it gets in your bloodstream. Because as long as it just ends up in your stomach, most of the time it's not going to hurt you. Obviously there's like food poisoning and stuff, but your stomach does a pretty good job of killing any bacteria that end up in it. Then you have your appendix. it's not exactly entirely clear what the true role of the appendix is. It is this little thing right here. It's a little finger-like extension, as it says, from the large intestine, and it's got a ring of follicles surrounding the lumen. It is generally filled with bacteria, and it used to be thought that your spleen helped kill any bacteria that made it through your small intestine. It is now thought, although this isn't like the total new scientific consensus, but one of the current theories being put forward for the function of the spleen is that it actually acts as a reservoir of good bacteria for your gut. Now you think about probiotics and yogurt and these natural products that you're supposed to eat because they contain the good bacteria. Well, your body keeps a little stash of it in your intestine so that if you have something like the flu, not your intestine, your appendix, if you have something like the flu and you've got, let's say, diarrhea for 2 days, you're pretty much flushing out everything that's in your colon. And you need to replenish your natural bacterial flora somehow. And it's thought that that might be what your appendix does. And then you have lymphatic tissue in lots of your other organs, which we won't necessarily talk about, but it's fun to kind of look for as you go through the rest of anatomy and physiology too. Every once in a while you'll be in some completely non-lymphatic organ and see a few follicles of lymphatic tissue. These two, where are we? Peyer's patches we haven't talked about yet. We have talked about the appendix. Peyer's patches are an example of that diffuse lymphatic tissue where you have clusters of follicles inside the wall of your small intestine. I am not at all sure what Peyer's patches do. They might be there to a certain extent to help regulate your body's reaction to things that pass through your gut. So think about people that have irritable bowel syndrome or gluten sensitivities. That happens because your immune system is active in your gut. And well, I won't say too much more about it because I don't really know too much more, but just know that you have some lymphatic tissue in your gut, which means your immune system is present there. And where'd we go? This is, so here's your small intestine. This is all the mucous membrane that's absorbing all of the food that flows through your small intestine. And here are all of these lymphoid follicles in the wall of small intestine. All right, that's blood vessel and lymphatic, under 30 minutes. If you're still listening, thanks for sticking with me. See you after the break.